afternoon. Welcome to the Rogue Theater. My name is Christopher Johnson. I am your assistant artistic director here at the Rogue. And thank you, Catherine. I directed our production of Great Expectations, which I hope you're here to listen to me talk about today. It's hard to know where to begin when talking about something as big and sort of unwieldy as Great Expectations. The endurance of its characters, the moment in history it reflects, the literary genre it is unto itself, and the impact it had on popular culture and the business of making and selling art all come to mind. Charles Dickens, of course, is up there with Shakespeare and Mark Twain as a writer widely beloved by both scholarly and mainstream audiences. Just out of my own curiosity, who here has never read the novel or seen a movie or TV version? Very good. Do you feel like you could still tell us the plot and name some of the characters? Because I feel like to an extent you all could. I read the novel for the first time somewhere in my early teens, I want to say maybe the 8th grade. And even though I thought it was very, very funny and delightfully gothic, it somewhat went over my head. In my early 20s, I watched and rewatched the 1998 film version with Ethan Hawke and Gwyneth Paltrow as Pip and Estella. And it was all about love for me then. Young love and forbidden love, and especially the unique and self-imposed torture of unrequited love. And now, as I'm approaching 40 and directing it as a play, I find myself sitting in rehearsal night after night and reminded of all the ways in which our youth is taken from us over the years, often prematurely, and replaced with things like fear and shame and resentment, reminded of that first rejection, that first slap to the face, or worse, reminded of the first person who doesn't love you back, or makes you see yourself as less than, even unlovable, reminded of how we tend to carry these little traumas with us for the rest of our lives, how they shape us and temper us like a blacksmith's hammer, how they somehow accumulate into what we now call adulthood. In the final scene of Great Expectations, Estella says to Pip, "We have been bent and broken by suffering, all of us, bent and broken. Have we been twisted into a better shape?" It's a good question. Charles Dickens was born in Portsmouth on February 7th, 1812. He was one of 8 children. He dearly loved the theater and dreamt of one day becoming an actor. He wrote his first play at the age of 9, a tragedy about the Sultan of India, which was performed for neighbors in the kitchen. 9-year-old Dickens wrote, directed, and played the lead. This instinct for overworking himself would grow over the years and would later be attributed to his dying somewhat young at the age of 58 of a stroke. But at the age of 12, his entire family, everyone except for him, was sent to debtor's prison. Common throughout the 19th century, debtor's prison was where folks were sent when they couldn't pay their debts. They performed manual labor until their debts were paid, including the cost of their imprisonment and any additional debt accrued in that time. But instead of debtor's prison, 12-year-old Dickens was pulled out of school and forced to work in a shoe polish factory with other lower-class men and boys. This is the peak of the Industrial Revolution. And Dickens got a front row seat to the human misery that made all those factories possible. Once he and his family were released, Dickens enrolled in a private school for about 3 years, leading him to a job working in a lawyer's office as a clerk at the age of about 15. After mastering shorthand, the clerking job soon turned into a job working as a parliamentary reporter and court stenographer in his early 20s. Now, this is when he began writing short stories and sketches, largely comedic, about city life, and publishing them in various periodicals. Now, his work reporting on the court system and political meetings for various newspapers meant that Dickens was very well versed in the socioeconomic conditions of London, which at the time was the largest city in the world. Before long, this expertise would lead him to become the best-selling author of his lifetime. Now, his first major success was the Pickwick Papers. And the Pickwick Papers told the story of a sort of bumbling adventurers club set in the English countryside. It was very low stakes and very uncomplicated and not much like his later output. Initially published as a magazine serial, one chapter at a time, 19 issues over the course of 1836 and 1837, the Pickwick Papers ushered in a new era of serialized fiction and cliffhanger endings. Chapters regularly ended with the promise that more would be revealed the following week. Pickwick was so popular that it was widely bootlegged, adapted for the stage multiple times without Dickens' knowledge or permission, and resulted in all manner of unofficial merchandise. Now, serialized storytelling was not a new invention in 1836, but the huge profits generated by Pickwick Papers resulted in serialization becoming the preferred method of buying and selling literature in the Victorian era. And almost overnight, 25-year-old Charles Dickens became a household name throughout Britain. He was incredibly prolific in his output, typically working on multiple novels and short stories at the same time. All of his full-length works appeared first as monthly serials before being published as 3-volume novels. Pickwick Papers was followed by Oliver Twist in 1837 and Nicholas Nickleby in 1838. Now, most of the people who consumed his writing did so by having it read aloud to them. We were about 50 years away from the first radio broadcasts, but Dickens laid the groundwork for just such content with his episodic cliffhanger model, giving people from all walks of life something to regularly share and look forward to all the year round. A reviewer in 1850 wrote, "There is not a fireside in the kingdom where the cunning fellow has not contrived to secure a corner for himself as one of the dearest, and by this time, one of the oldest friends of the family." A good test of literature, of course, is in how it endures. But Dickens broke the mold in how he entertained, telling stories in a way that we might today call binge-worthy. It was an enormous sea change that you can follow all the way forward to Flash Gordon and the original Star Wars trilogy, and even to what's happening today with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We might as well give Dickens credit for James Bond Will Return and Luke, I Am Your Father. Because that's the lineage of storytelling that's being emulated, at least from a commercial standpoint. So, in 1843, he published A Christmas Carol, which he claims to have written in a matter of weeks. In 1847, he helped to open a home for reformed prostitutes, which he later took over operation of himself. I don't know what that does for any of our understanding or appreciation of Great Expectations, but I just find it wildly interesting. In 1848, Dickens started his own amateur theater company, which he acted in for charity, usually reading from his own stories, but often adapting the work of his contemporaries as well. His troupe even performed for Queen Victoria in 1851. She had just been crowned a year after the first publication date of Pickwick Papers. Throughout his career, he had numerous public feuds with rival writers and publishers. He sired 10 children with Catherine Hogarth, who he eventually left for an actress half his age, and gave public reading tours in America, where they loved and celebrated him until he released American Notes for general circulation. This was a kind of travelogue of the eastern United States, criticizing, among other things, our tendency to swarm celebrities, our widespread use of tobacco, and most especially our excessive use of violence against our slaves, which, by the way, he added, maybe we should think about emancipating. Dickens' progress report on America was basically that we had cultivated the ideas of liberty and equality as permissions to shoot and stab anyone that we wanted to, or at least anyone who might get in the way of our making money. It's been over 150 years, but that still holds some water, folks. In his later years, Dickens began to inject his writing with more and more social critique, as well as an overall darker tone more accurately reflecting the grisly realities of life in Victorian London, especially for the young and vulnerable. That last element, the depiction of underprivileged children in his stories, was something of a specialty of Dickens' work over the years. Just think of some of his best-known characters: Oliver Twist, Little Nell, Tiny Tim, Artful Dodger, David Copperfield, and of course, Pip in Great Expectations. According to Dickens scholar George Newland, Dickens' body of work features 149 characters who are full orphans, plus 82 with no father and another 87 with no mother, making for 318 full or partial orphans total. He adds that, quote, only 15 named characters we deem significant in the major novels and Christmas books had or have two parents, and in nearly half of these cases, their families today would be considered dysfunctional. Even Estella, the high-class object of Pip's desire in Great Expectations, is just another suffering orphan at the end of the day. That's not a spoiler, by the way. Her true parentage is where I think we get into spoiler territory. But why all these miserable children in his stories? And why were so many people rushing out week after week after week to buy them? Well, Dickens was never an orphan, unless you count his 3 months in the shoe polish factory. But he absolutely suffered in his youth and saw the misery of the poor English child up close and personal in his court reporter days, making him especially qualified to reflect a significant change that was taking place at the time in both Britain and America, an increase in our sympathy for the plight of children. Scholars largely attribute this shift to the emergence of the middle class, which was initially defined as a class between the peasants who worked the fields and the nobility who owned the land. The middle class, or the middling sort as they were initially known in Europe, are what was originally meant by the term bourgeoisie, which literally translates to town dwellers, because that's what existed between the peasants and nobility, apparently, a house in town and some kind of mercantile job. I found a great essay about this by Robert Newsom called Fictions in Childhood. He says, in the early modern period, and undoubtedly associated with the emergence of individualism and the rise of the middle class and the domestic, there emerged an idea of the child, quite unlike earlier conceptions, which had assumed children to be essentially animalistic and uninteresting, or merely deficient, undeveloped, and incomplete adults. I really love that definition. By the late 18th century, however, the child came to be recognized as a qualitatively different being, perhaps closer to humankind's original, natural, even prelapsarian state, and deserving of special care, both for the sake of its healthy cultivation and to preserve its innocence for as long as possible. Now, Newsom speculates that Dickens's mass market success may have been partially a result of his many, many young and vulnerable protagonists. He goes on to argue that the popularity of these protagonists may have helped to cement our growing cultural sympathy for children. Newsom also attributes the child-aged characters of Emily and Charlotte Bronte, Robert Louis Stevenson, Henry James, Mark Twain, Lewis Carroll, James Joyce, Rudyard Kipling, and many others back to Dickens's body of work. And I could say, having spent so much time with Pip over the last couple of months, it's hard not to see how he and his peers in Dickens's work may have made the way for characters like Mowgli and Alice, Jim Hawkins, Huck Finn. Before I move on from this subject, I want to share a particular observation that Dickens makes about the conditions of poor children within the Victorian justice system. Now, this comes from the character of Mr. Jaggers in Great Expectations. Mr. Jaggers is a London lawyer. He's reflecting on the early days of his career, and this speech comes toward the end of our play. And many apologies to my good friend Joseph McGrath, who gives this speech beautifully in our production, so you will have to come back. But Jaggers says, "I put it to you, Mr. Pip, that there was once a lawyer, no connection to anyone living nor dead, who entered his profession with the highest of hopes because he wanted to do good in the world. And this lawyer, Mr. Pip, with all his high hopes, entered into an atmosphere of evil. Day after day, Mr. Pip, he went about his work and saw evil. And all he saw of children, Pip, from the minute they were born, from the minute they were brought into this evil world, was that they were brought there to be destroyed. Day after day, Mr. Pip, he saw them being tried. He saw them being tried at the criminal bar. Day after day, he saw them brought out to be whipped, brought out to be imprisoned, transported, neglected, cast out, qualified for nothing but the hangman, growing up for nothing but to be hanged. And I have seen it too, Pip. I saw it then, and I see it still." This system Jaggers identifies is what we today call the school-to-prison pipeline. Yep. Dickens' work is full of these just brutally incisive observations about how modern life really works and who's really paying for it. And he, of course, knew firsthand that there was almost no greater crime in Western civilization than to be poor. Dickens' later novels include Bleak House, Hard Times, and A Tale of Two Cities. His 13th novel, Great Expectations, began to roll out on a weekly basis in December of 1860 to near universal acclaim, selling on average about 100,000 copies a week through August of 1861, when the final two chapters were released. Dickens went out of his way to imbue the novel with more comedy than usual after complaints of humorlessness in 1859's Tale of Two Cities, which had a more historical thing going for it. Great Expectations was his second novel to be written with a first-person narrator protagonist after his semi-autobiographical novel, David Copperfield, in 1850. His friendship with author and painter Wilkie Collins, who wrote A Woman in White, inspired him to play with more than usual elements of mystery in Great Expectations, which features numerous suspenseful reveals of who committed what crime and who was whose real father and other things I won't spoil here for those of you coming in fresh. Great Expectations tells the story of the orphan Pip, who meets an escaped convict named Magwitch one day in the cemetery where his family is buried. Upon threat of death, Magwitch forces Pip to help him escape his chains by stealing a file from the local blacksmith who Pip lives with. The convict is freed and vows never to forget how Pip helped him before disappearing into the fog on the marsh. It's a lovely, ominous moment. Soon after, much of the first chunk of the story happens in just the first 6 days. But soon after, he meets a beautiful young girl named Estella when he is recruited to be her playmate. Pip falls desperately in love with Estella, despite being terrified of her adopted mother, the wealthy spinster Miss Havisham. One of Dickens' most memorable creations, Miss Havisham still wears the wedding dress from when she was left at the altar many years prior. Like most of the adults in Pip's life, she is infantile and mean and a frequent source of terror. Not that Estella is all that pleasant herself. Estella bullies Pip mercilessly, pointing out to him that his hands are coarse and his boots are thick, sending him away from their first playdate in tears. This rebuff from the object of his desire wounds him so profoundly as to change his opinion, not only of himself, but of the people who love and accept him as he is. It is a revelation to 7-year-old Pip that there is anything to be ashamed of in his coarse hands and his thick boots. Before meeting Estella, these were just the natural qualities of his hands and his boots. But they are transformed in an instant by Estella's cruel words into unshakable evidence of his low class and his undesirability. So first Magwitch, the convict, pushes him to steal, and then Miss Havisham and Estella make him feel as though he ought to hide. Next, Pip finds himself compelled to lie about how enjoyable it is uptown, reporting to his caretakers not that Estella and Miss Havisham terrorized him, but that they all stood around and played with flags. There's something going on here about how growing up can feel like a life of crime, but I'm still sort of wrapping my head around it. But after Pip comes home from meeting Estella and lies about it, he soon confesses to Jo the blacksmith, "She told me I was common, and I looked at myself, and I knew. I am common." And that's where the lies come from somehow. The main thing to know is what Pip believes from this point forward in the story, that until he sheds his impoverished upbringing and becomes a proper gentleman, Estella will always be out of his reach. Luckily for Pip, a chance to get the girl in just this way falls into his lap with the arrival of Mr. Jaggers, a lawyer from London representing an unnamed benefactor who, for reasons unknown, has decided to anonymously provide the financial means for Pip's education and advancement as a gentleman. Or in Jaggers' own words, the boy has great expectations. And that, broadly, is half of what is meant by the title. The other half, I think, refers to Pip's expectations that his life will be made better by wealth and status, that he will have more worth as a person, that Estella will love him back, and that he will then be able to live the rest of his days happily and content. So, this is where I would like to bring out some of the cast to perform a scene from the end of Act 1, in which much of what I've just described comes to a head. I want to start.
What's wrong?
Nothing.
Let's talk, Pip. Shall we? You and me, us both together, and have a proper talk.
If you like.
Then tell me, Pip. What's wrong?
Will you be secret?
Yes, Pip, I will.
Do you promise?
I promise.
Biddy! I want to be a gentleman!
Oh, I wouldn't if I were you.
Biddy?
What, don't you think you're happier as you are?
Biddy, I'm not at all happy as I am.
Sorry to hear that. I just want you to do well. Be comfortable.
Understand, Biddy, once and for all. I can never be comfortable. Never anything but miserable. Unless I lead a very different kind of life than the life that I lead now.
That's a pity.
You're right, Biddy. It is a pity. it is a pity, but I can't help it. If I could have settled down. If I could have settled down and been half as fond of the forge now as when I was little, it would have been much better for me. You and I and Jo would have wanted nothing then. Jo and I might be partners, and I might have grown up to keep company with you. I should have been good enough for you, shouldn't I, Biddy?
Yes. I'm not over particular.
Well, I am, Biddy. I am. And look at me. Dissatisfied and uncomfortable and... Why should I care about being coarse if no one had told me so?
Well, that's not a very polite thing, not a very true thing to say. Who said it?
The beautiful lady at Miss Avisham's. And she's more beautiful than anybody ever was. And I admire her dreadfully, and I want to become a gentleman on her account.
Do you want to be a gentleman to spite her or to win her over?
I don't know.
Because if it is to spite her, I should think, but you know best, that might be better done by not caring for her words. And if it's to win her over, I should think, but you know best, that she might not be worth winning.
You may be right, Biddy. In fact, I know you're right. But the thing is, Biddy, the thing is, I admire her dreadfully.
Glad of one thing. That is, you felt you could tell me everything, Pip.
Biddy, I will always tell you everything.
Till you are a gentleman.
And that means forever, Biddy. That means forever.
Is this the boy called Pip?
Yes, he is, and what is it to you?
My name is Jaggers. I am a lawyer in London, and as for the boy, he has great expectations. Furthermore, he will come into a handsome property. Furthermore, the possessor of this property wishes to take him out from his present sphere of life and have him brought up as a gentleman. Furthermore, it is a condition of the person from whom I take my instructions that the young man always bears the name of Pip. Furthermore, it is a condition of the person from whom I take my instructions that his or her identity remain a profound secret. I am empowered only to mention that I am empowered only to mention that it is the intention of the aforesaid person to reveal his or her identity at first hand by word of mouth to yourself. When it is to be revealed, I cannot say. It may be years hence. In the meantime, you are distinctly to understand that you are positively prohibited from making any inquiries on this head, or any allusions or references, however distant, to any individual whomsoever as the individual in all communications you may have with me. Is that clear? Is that clear? Good. You will come to London. When?
I suppose directly.
You suppose directly. First, you will need new clothes. So let us say today week. You'll want some money. Shall I give you 20 guineas? Do you think 20 guineas will be ample? Here they are. Well, Joseph Guthrie, you look dumbfounded.
I am.
Is it understood you want nothing for yourself?
It were understood, and it are understood, and it ever will be understood.
But what if I were instructed to make you a present as compensation?
Compensation for what?
For the loss of his services.
Do you think money can make compensation to me for the loss of the little child? What came to the forge and ever the best of friends?
I warn you, Joseph Guthrie, this is your last chance. If you mean to take a present, which I have it in charge to make you, speak out, and you shall have it. If, on the contrary, you mean to say...
Which I mean to say, if you come into my place, bull baiting and badger at me, come out. Which I mean to say is such, if you're a man, come out. Which I mean to say that what I say, I mean to say.
Well, Mr. Pip, the sooner you leave here, the better. Let us make it 5 days hence. Come straight to my office. Here it is. But understand, I express no opinion on the trust I undertake. I am paid for undertaking it, and I do so. I do as I am paid. Nothing less, nothing more. Now understand that. Finally, understand that.
Thank you, Joe, Matt, Hunter, and Chelsea.
Every time I hear that speech of Jagger's, I think of those user agreements on our phones that we're all pretending to read. What I love about the first half of that scene with Biddy is the way it shows us that Pip already has everything a person could need in life. Modest home in the country, an honest job apprenticed to a blacksmith, and a small but loyal family that loves him very much just the way he is. But these things, of course, don't fit into what a gentleman's life should look like, as Jaggers makes clear with his statement, the sooner you leave here, the better. Both what is expected of Pip and what Dickens really thinks of a gentleman is nicely illustrated in a lesson from Pip's tutor in London, Herbert Pocket. In a short speech from Act 2 of our production, Herbert says, "Understand, Pip, a gentleman does not work. A gentleman lives off the work of others. A gentleman does not soil his hands. A gentleman may be a brewer, but never brew. He owns those who do. A gentleman may be a banker, but never bank. He owns those who do. A gentleman does not build. He owns the builders. A gentleman does not labor. He owns the laborers. A gentleman does not work the earth. He owns the earth." Dickens is unsparing in his portrayal of the excesses and hollowness of the upper class, especially in his portrayal of Miss Havisham and her extended family. But he also exposes the general weakness of the rest of us to get caught up in the pursuit of the material, to buy the lie, just so we can sell it ourselves. Later in the novel, when Pip is settled into city life in London and has learned to spend his new allowance conspicuously, like a gentleman should, Dickens writes, "We spent as much money as we could and got as little for it as people could make up their minds to give us. We were always more or less miserable, and most of our acquaintance were in the same condition. There was a gay fiction among us that we were constantly enjoying ourselves, and a skeleton truth that we never did. To the best of my belief, our case was in the last aspect a rather common one." For Pip in London, nothing goes according to plan, or happens smoothly, or as expected. Lessons offered freely don't stick until they come at enormous cost. His allowance turns into his debts. His mysterious benefactor is eventually revealed to be a source of great embarrassment and chaos. And Estella only orbits further out of his reach, becoming engaged to one of Pip's wealthy rivals. Worse still, Pip collides with each of these disappointments essentially alone, having discarded the people who really care about him, Jo and Biddy, back at home. Jo does come to visit Pip in London, but the damage is done, and their old, easy friendship is strained. Jo is as uncomfortable in the city as Pip was in the village, the difference being that Pip was perfectly comfortable in the village until he met Estella and learned to turn up his nose. Great Expectations is a Bildungsroman, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, a Bildungsroman, German for novel of education, what we now more commonly refer to as a coming-of-age tale. This is a literary genre that had only just arisen in the previous century as we know it, dating back to a German novel called Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship in 1796. Now, the basic premise of a Bildungsroman is a story focused on the moral and psychological development of a character from childhood to adulthood, a journey marked by struggle and by gradual change. Historians track the origins of the coming-of-age story back to early folklore concerning the figure of the dunce, or the youngest child, going out into the wider world in search of experience or riches, often after a significant loss or revelation motivates them to leave home. As I understand it, Great Expectations is an icon of the genre, as it is an icon of the Victorian novel. Part of what makes it so well representative of the Victorian novel is the way that the incredibly complicated plot coheres together by the end of the story. Every mystery is solved just as intricately as it is set up. Every loose thread finds connection. Now, I want to talk about the adaptation next, but before we do, I want to go over one more aspect of the story that's a little more under the surface. And this is the aspect of revenge. And it's primarily reflected in the actions of the older characters in the story. Now, Miss Havisham, remember, was left at the altar many years ago and has yet to take off that wedding dress. Even her bride cake is still sitting on its table, covered now in cobwebs and dust. And we learn early on in the story that Miss Havisham adopted Estella for the sole purpose of taking revenge on not only the men who left her on their wedding day, but on all men, maybe even on love itself. She raises Estella to seduce and destroy, because that's what happened to her. But when all is said and done, she's just salting her own wound and spreading the hurt to her own adopted daughter. Magwitch, the escaped convict Pip meets in the cemetery, does return later in the story. And though it's harder to pin down, his purpose for returning into Pip's life is also rooted in vengeance, in righting the wrongs of his past as he sees them. Now, on the flip side of these two characters, we have Joe, the blacksmith, who Matt Wally plays in our production. He takes care of Pip and Pip's older sister. Joe is gentle and sweet and funny and doesn't have a spiteful bone in his body. Early on, he tells Pip a sad but lovely story about how his father beat him and his mother mercilessly while Joe was growing up. But Joe is nothing like his abusive father, so you might think, here's a man who broke the cycle. But Joe took in Pip and his older sister, Mrs. Joe, and Mrs. Joe is physically abusive to both Pip and Joe on a daily basis. Joe takes her beatings and watches Pip take them too, as his way of not becoming his father. But you could argue that he's further enabling the physical violence of his childhood by choosing and staying with someone who maintains the status quo for him. This is not a broken cycle. Joe's father is still beating him. He's just using Mrs. Joe's hands to do it. As much as Great Expectations is about the very complicated business of growing up, the adult characters we meet aren't much more advanced than the children in their care. So let's talk about the script. Based on my research, there are about 20 different stage adaptations of Great Expectations out there to choose from if you'd like to produce it as a play. And I'm sure that's an undercount. The first adaptation on record was written by and starred Sir Alec Guinness in 1939. Similarly, it's been adapted for film and television more than 20 times, including a 6-part miniseries filming right now for the BBC and FX with Olivia Colman as Miss Havisham. More than 20 sounds high, but consider that there are over 130 films on record attributed to Dickens' stories. Oliver Twist and Christmas Carol have over 30 film versions to their name each and are only surpassed by Dracula and Jekyll and Hyde for more film adaptations on record. Now, if you're a regular patron of the Rogue, Great Expectations has probably been on your bingo sheet of adaptations likely to show up in a future season for a while. Shakespeare and great novels are a regular staple of what gets produced around here, for a lot of good reasons. Adaptations cut right to the chase of the Rogue's mission of presenting great literature. Best of all, adaptations frequently come with an enormous amount of name recognition built in, which makes them very marketable. Not only has most everyone in a theater-going audience probably heard of Great Expectations or Mrs. Dalloway or Moby Dick, they've probably never seen any of those attempted as a play. Adaptations automatically generate excitement for a given project simply in contemplating the translation from one medium to the next. How are they going to make that work? The tension of this particular mystery compels us both, audience and theater artists alike, to see what's possible. So it should be no surprise that Great Expectations is the 25th play the Rogue will do that is based on a book. That's twice the amount of Shakespeare we've done. This is the Rogue's 18th season. We've only had one season that did not include an adaptation of some kind. 7 of our adaptations were written by Cindy Meyer. I've written 3 myself, and I can tell you that we do have a kind of unofficial house style. We always prioritize the voice of the author in adapting a work of fiction, taking the original text and cutting it away like a sculptor would a block of stone. We try to keep our own voice out of the writing and instead edit down the original text until it's the length and shape of a play rather than a novel. We also tend to embrace a device that most playwrights consider a huge no-no, which is narration. Typically, we use multiple narrators. So, how does this adaptation work? Very, very differently. Jo Clifford is a playwright and performance artist based in Edinburgh. She's the author of over 100 plays, the bulk of which are adaptations. She is also well known for her autobiographical one-woman shows. She is the first trans playwright we have produced at the Rogue. And you would never know this personal detail from reading her script or seeing our production, but representation matters, and I think it's a fabulous first. But Clifford started working on the adaptation in 1988 for an educational theater company in Glasgow. In a matter of weeks, she workshopped the script with the original cast, a mix of 4 actors and 4 dancers. Since then, her adaptation has been toured around the globe, was revived as part of the official bicentenary celebration of Dickens' birth, and is the current preferred stage adaptation of the Dickens Trust. And while there have been many adaptations over the years, Jo Clifford's Great Expectations is the only one to have been produced on the West End. The first thing you'll notice, if you hold her script up to the novel, is the economy of the language. Sentences are short and simple. Dickens had a very particular writing voice, with a tendency towards long, dense sentences. I went looking for a good example of this to share with you, and I came upon this one of the first sentences from the book. It's a description of the cemetery where we first meet Pip, and it goes like this. At such a time, I found out for certain that this bleak place overgrown with nettles was the churchyard, and that Philip Pirip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried, and that the dark flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dikes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes, and that the low leaden line beyond was the river, and that the distant savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea, and that the small bundle of shivers growing afraid of it all and beginning to cry was Pip. It's one sentence. The same place is described for us in the adaptation as where the churchyard was, where the dark flat wilderness was the lonely marsh, where the low leaden line was the river, where the small bundle of shivers growing afraid of it all and beginning to cry was Pip. One sentence. 38 words in the adaptation compared to 124 in the novel. We still get that lovely touch of Dickens' wit when Pip refers to himself as the small bundle of shivers, but the length and clarity of the sentence is now tuned for the ears of a modern audience. And this should give you a good sense of what to expect throughout. Broadly, we lose some characters, some subplots, and the specificity of Dickens' 19th century voice. But what we get in return is a beautifully concentrated Great Expectations with his greatest strength, memorable and vivid characters at the forefront. The costumes, music, and dialect that the play asks for also restore a lot of the particulars of the time and place that are lost in the streamlined language. There's very little narration compared to the adaptations we've produced before at the Rogue. And there's only one narrator, and it's Pip. In Dickens' novel, there are essentially three Pips. There's the child we meet at 7 and watch grow into his teens, the young man of 18 who sets out for London to become a gentleman, and the narrator of the story who is 35 and looking back over it all. Now, in Jo Clifford's script, she rather brilliantly adapts this trio of Pips by giving us two. An adult Pip who narrates the action from the sidelines, talking directly to the audience, and a younger actor who plays Pip, who we see performing the action of the story throughout, from 7 to 21. Now, Jo Clifford, obviously, when she was workshopping this script, did not have an actor who could so convincingly play both a boy and a man on the turn of a dime as our own Hunter Nant. So in our production, I've tasked Hunter with playing both roles. He narrates the story from later in Pip's life and plays the 7-year-old Pip we meet in the first scene and onward. He does not leave the stage once, unless you count intermission. And I'm hoping he has the energy at intermission to get up and get a drink of water. He speaks in both the Cockney accent of Pip's youth and the higher class standard British dialect Pip adopts as a gentleman. Perhaps most difficult, Hunter is tasked with gradually, almost imperceptibly aging about 10 years over the course of the first act of the play, which clocks in at just under an hour. Or as Jo put it recently, Hunter has his hands full. Speaking of Jo, I've also made his job somewhat more difficult by placing him in two parts originally written to be performed by two different actors. Jagger's the lawyer, but he also plays Magwitch, the escaped convict. Jo plays both men in our production. At one point, he even does so in the same scene. There was not a lot of method in this idea. It's just what I saw when I read the script for the first time. And I kind of laughed out loud like that. And since any good script is just a list of problems to solve, and since what's often most delightful about a play is how its problems are solved, when I direct, I try to do things the hard way, when I have the option. It's always more interesting, I think, for us and for you. The average audiobook of Great Expectations, of which there are dozens available for download, is about 20 hours in length. Jo Clifford's adaptation comes in at just under 2. A dense and energetic 2 hours. The play moves very, very quickly. We're frequently changing from one location to another in a matter of seconds, which is why this set is designed sort of like a wedding cake made out of stairs. You can move up and down really quickly, but also in circles. Having steps that run up the middle with gaps in between allow us to have sort of the distinction of different rooms or spaces on a single platform. But one of the most helpful techniques we had for dealing with the speed with which the play moves and changes time and place comes from using actor-motivated scenery. Actor-motivated scenery is a set piece that can move itself on and off stage. So think of a child in a school play pretending to be a tree. We think of that as kind of a joke, right? And it is usually reserved for the kids who aren't up to performing But when done creatively and with talented actors, it can be incredibly evocative. So actor-motivated scenery is something I first learned about when I was 16 years old, and I went to see the Rocky Horror Picture Show at the Loft. This is part of a long tradition of midnight showings in which a full cast of actors and dancers perform the scenes from the movie in front of a big screen where the movie is simultaneously playing. It's called the Shadow Cast, and it's a ton of fun. And it's this weekend, actually. It's tonight. It's Halloween tonight. That's when I went when I was 16, to the Halloween Shadow Cast. So, early in the movie, I'm going to try and get to my point here. Early in the movie, there's a scene in which Brad and Janet are driving in the rain. They're lost, it's nighttime. Now, if we were doing this on stage, you really only need 2 chairs and 2 actors who are familiar with being in a moving car. But the shadow cast of the Rocky Horror Picture Show takes this depiction to the next level by enlisting 2 of the ensemble actors to play the windshield wipers on the car. I want to show you how this works. Joe, come here, Joe. Chris Pankratz, can you come up and you can be Brad? I drive the car. All right, so just bear with us for a second here. No, let's do it up here where we have room. So, Chris, if you want to drive, if you'll sit on the edge there. All right, so Chris is driving, but you, other way, turn around the other way. There you go. So now, before we do this, you have to imagine that Joe and I, in the ensemble of the Rocky Horror Show, that we're both wearing corsets and fishnet stockings. All right, so driving along, and it's raining, do your left leg. Okay. Straight up. Thank you. So 2 things are accomplished here that support the storytelling. First, the audience has been made to use their imagination, which hopefully is as rewarding as it is entertaining and will encourage them to keep doing so as the story moves forward. Second, Rocky Horror's major theme of sex positivity is integrated into the storytelling itself by portraying windshield wipers with 2 sets of legs in fishnet stockings. As I mentioned at the beginning, these are set pieces that can move themselves on and off stage so they don't hinder the pace of your production. So, we've emulated this method in a couple of ways for Great Expectations. You will see actors playing gravestones in the cemetery, as death masks hanging from the wall in Jaggers' office, as cows being butchered in a field, and Gothic statues holding candelabras. The major theme I wanted to elaborate with these set pieces is the close proximity to death in Victorian London, as felt by both the rich and the poor. And I just have one more, I'm going to show you real quick an example from ours. So this was made by Chris Pankratz, who was just up here with us. This is a gravestone for the cemetery, and normally someone might come out and set it down and leave it there, and we're in the cemetery. But in our production, you get something a little more evocative, which is that the actor comes out. We have a brilliant prop master. So in a typical Rogue production, these are details that might be described by multiple narrators for us to imagine. Since this adaptation is so short on narration, I wanted to give some of these details physical life so that we could still enlist your imagination in telling the story. We can only do so much up here. The fireworks happen out here. One more small insight I can give you into our production is something I learned very early in rehearsals. I noticed right away that if a scene wasn't quite right or seem to be missing something, 9 times out of 10, the problem could be solved by humiliating our main character in some way. By torturing Pip. We pinch him and slap him and sneak up behind him. We pull him by the ear and call him names and generally do everything we can to make Pip and sometimes Hunter miserable. And the more abuse he takes, the more we love him. The more the adults in his life terrorize him, the better we remember being children ourselves. The more we break his heart, the softer ours become. And I think I see now a little better what Dickens was up to. At the end of the day, Great Expectations seems to be about how we treat one another, especially the ones we love. How we succeed or fail to express that love, how we give our love, often where it cannot be received or returned, and how with maturity we might learn to love as though our hearts were foolish. That's my presentation. Thank you for your time today.